Hey folks, welcome to episode 7 of the Appalachian Roundup. Today we're going to talk about mortality rates, or why people in Appalachia are dying younger on average than their grandparents did a generation ago. Why is that? Stay with us. An article in the Atlantic Monthly is what made me start thinking about this. It's called How Rural America Steals Girls' Futures. I'll post a link down below. But the author is from Arkansas, which isn't quite Appalachia, but she's talking about rural America and her experience growing up in rural America. And while it's not Appalachia, it does certainly relate to Appalachia. It's a story that I've seen repeat, several times over the course of my life. But it goes something like this. Imagine a situation where you have two girls, both of them want to leave their rural town or their rural, mountain or whatever. And one of the girls comes from money or has educated parents or really socially strict parents, maybe evangelical, maybe not. On the other hand, the other girl does not really come from money. Maybe she doesn't come from parents with education, and she doesn't have parents who are very supervisory. They're just basically letting her do what she wants, make the decisions she makes without supervising her. The outcome is that, one girl, and she's talking about herself in this article, she's able to leave, and her very good friend, that girl, isn't able to leave. And so what are the different outcomes? Basically, she's looking at things like how this leads to teenage pregnancy, drug addiction, and other things. I mean, it certainly doesn't lead to it necessarily, but it creates the conditions that set the stage for it, you might say. And what this means is the overall kind of like social situation that she sketches out here is replicated all over the United States in different places. And, I've certainly seen this in my neck of the woods in Southwest Virginia there. What she's talking about here is how this leads to a situation where men are dying on the average of 3 years younger, and it's even worse. Women are dying 5 years younger than previous generations. And so what this means is, people in Appalachia, people in rural America are dying younger. And she's kind of sketching out some of the social situations that lead to this. But certainly the social environment is not the only environment not the only causal factor that matters here. And so again, I'm thinking about what are some other causal factors that lead to a situation where people in rural America, like Appalachia, are dying younger. What's going on there? Well, one of the causal factors in leading to this kind of disparity, this situation, was a piece published by PBS called, quote, West Virginia Doctors Work to Bridge Healthcare Gap Between Rural and Suburban/Urban America. And basically, anybody who lives in Appalachia knows that the healthcare situation in Appalachia is pretty not the best. I did a video last month looking at healthcare in Appalachia, and particularly looking at ballot healthcare, which is the one I know best. And again, it's the same point. It's pretty low quality. But the gap, what is the gap that they're talking about here? The article focuses on three main factors here that creates this gap. Number one, it's demographic factors, and that includes things like you have a really generally an older population living in Appalachia. You have a poorer population in Appalachia. Poorer meaning they have trouble affording their medications. Okay. Thirdly, you have a sicker population. The article highlights how, in terms of Appalachia, you have a situation where people suffer more and more severe cases and more frequent cases of chronic diseases in Appalachia compared to anywhere else in the United States. The other issue is, number two, is that there's a shortage of doctors and nurses. And again, this links up to this video I did last month. Again, that's one of the major causes of problems with the ballot health system in Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, that area. where you don't have enough doctors and nurses, and then the doctors and nurses you do have, generally, because there is such a shortage, there is a lower quality doctor and nurses. So you have lower pay, lower quality. And then the third factor they highlight here is the long travel distances between where somebody lives up in the mountains and getting over to town to get some kind of medical care. And so, I mean, again, like the situation that I grew up in was basically, we lived up in the mountains and we were a good 35 or 40 minutes from the hospital. And that's if you were to immediately jump into a truck and run somebody to the hospital. If you were waiting on the ambulance, then you're talking 20 or 30 minutes for the ambulance and then another 30 or 40 minutes to the ER. And so we're looking at a pretty significant time here. This distance was deadly. I mean, that's one of the key factors here, I think, that really matters. And so, when we think about what's going on here, these factors, we're looking at political and economic causes are very important here in terms of understanding why people have this gap, why there's such a gap between Appalachia and people living in Chicago or wherever they happen to be. And when we think about political economic causes, think about it like this. Somebody in West Virginia, who has to travel 45 minutes to a doctor, that is the case because they depend on markets for providing services, okay? But if we had a system where there was let's say, a robust public health care system, you have kids going to medical school, the government pays for their education, those new doctors now serve a certain community, an underfunded or low-income community for a number of years, like say 7 years, and then that enables the loans to be paid off, and that provides medical care for particular rural areas. Okay, that's just one model. I mean, there are other ways to do this. What I'm getting at here is in terms of a system based on market supply and demand, which the outcome means that there is inadequate market supply or market demand in rural West Virginia, and so there's no doctor there. And so you have to travel an hour. That leaves this creates this gap that we're talking about. And so what I'm suggesting is one way to think about this is a shortcoming of the very system we have that we depend on. It's a shortcoming of it. And one way to deal with that is to have a more robust public healthcare system that basically puts doctors where they are needed, rather than us depending on the damn market to supply doctors, okay? So we take charge of our healthcare system and we put doctors where they are needed through a public healthcare system. And this also addresses the nurse and doctor shortages. It's not that in the United States there are too few doctors and nurses. It's that in Appalachia there's a scarcity of nurses and doctors. There are here in Chicago there are adequate nurses and doctors, but that's not the case in Appalachia. And so again, in terms of how do you address that, both in terms of understanding the problem and then how to address that. Again, the problem is that we depend on the market to meet our demands. And in many cases that works out just fine if you want to go get a new car. But in terms of healthcare, maybe that's not the best solution. And then another reason, deaths of despair. And these disproportionately impact rural America, and they disproportionately impact Appalachia. And when they talk about deaths of despair, they're talking about like suicide, opioid overdoses, or liver disease brought on by alcoholism. And I did a video about this a few weeks ago, and I'll post the link down below. But the gist of it is that during the pandemic in particular, these numbers started going up, and you had just more deaths of despair in Appalachia, more deaths of despair in rural America, and these deaths centered on particularly opioid overdoses. And the point that I make is that opioid overdoses, while they are terrible, are part of this is like corporations making billions of dollars, like Pfizer and the Sackler family, but there are all sorts of other corporations out there: Walmart, pharmacy, Walgreens, pharmacy, CVS, pharmacy, Amerisource, AmerisourceBergen, any number of different distributors, manufacturers of those opioid pills, and the pharmacies and so forth that distribute it. And all of this, they have made billions and billions and billions of dollars. And they have effectively, the point is, they've made billions of dollars while hundreds of thousands of people in Appalachia have died. Hundreds of thousands of people across the United States have died since the mid-1990s, when these opioids hit the market, and they were heavily marketed and overprescribed and oversold and over-distributed to these particular areas. And so my point is, this has been like an economic cause of death. Basically, people have been addicted by these companies and overdosed and died. And so deaths of despair are part of the capitalistic process of making money. And so what we're looking at here is like, why are people dying in Appalachia? Why are people dying in rural America in such high numbers? It's a combination of these things. It's companies basically reaping massive profits on dead people, markets unable to meet actual demand. So those are like what I'm calling economic causes of death. And again, like we're talking about mortality rates here, and I'm suggesting things like markets and politics kill us, and that we could do better by ourselves if we didn't sell our souls to the market in terms of especially healthcare. Another piece here, published by the WRAL out of Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, describes how the Medicaid expansion could shrink the life expectancy gap between suburban and rural residents in that state. And they highlight the examples they use point again to this gap. They use the example of Swain County, which is in the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina there, just south of Asheville. And it's a really rural county, and the average age that a person lives to in that county is 71 years old. Okay, that's in Appalachia, 71 years. Now they flash over here to Raleigh-Durham, the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill Triad, where you have all these universities, you have all this business, all this activity going on over there. And in Wake County, the average age that people live to is 81.6 years. So what you're looking at here is a 10-year gap between somebody living in Appalachia and somebody living in Raleigh. And what will help explain that gap? This article is highlighting Medicaid. Medicaid is a federal program, of course, that is meant to provide some kind of health care to people who cannot afford it. North Carolina politicians refuse to accept the Medicaid expansion that came under Obamacare. And so part of Obamacare was this expansion of Medicaid to include more people on Medicaid rolls. But for any number of complicated reasons, ideologically mostly, there were a number of states that were governed by Republicans refused to accept the Medicaid expansion. Now, what this meant was effectively is that a whole bunch of residents of those states didn't have health care. What that meant was they would die younger. And this is the outcome of it, And so what we have is a situation where politicians hewing to ideological lines end up culling part of their population. So that's a political cause right there. And so we're looking at political and economic causes and the way they contribute to basically Appalachians and rural people dying. So we have, it's just like a horrible ass situation.